During the 17th century, the city of Amsterdam basked in a golden age. In 1631, a 25-year-old Dutch artist arrived here from his home city of Leiden. His sole intention was to take advantage of Amsterdam's thriving art market and build a career as a famous artist. His name was Rembrandt van Rijn. Rembrandt became one of the greatest Dutch artists of the 17th century, a giant of the Baroque era. He was influenced by the artistic developments of his day. But from the very beginning of his working life, Rembrandt pursued his own agenda. Rembrandt Harmens van Rijn was born on 15 July 1606 in the university city of Leiden. The son of a miller, he was the eighth of 9 children. Details of his early life are sketchy, but his parents must have been impressed with his young intellect. At the age of 7, he was sent to Leiden's Latin school. 7 years later, he enrolled at the famous university with the intention of studying classics. But already he knew that a life of books was not for him. He had begun to feel his real calling in life: art. Though no paintings of Rembrandt's youth have survived, at the age of just 14, he withdrew from university to begin his training as an artist. His first master was a local painter, Jacob van Swanenburg. He then journeyed to Amsterdam for a 6-month period in the studio of Pieter Lastman, a painter of historical scenes. Lastman had visited Italy to experience firsthand the great paintings of the Renaissance. But the young Rembrandt chose not to visit Rome, Florence, or Venice. Already, he was making his own decisions and determining his own influences.
He was asked, why don't you go to Italy? And he said, well, why should I? Because there are prints available of all Italians, after the works of all great Italian masters. And Amsterdam is such an important city in the world, in the trading of art. The most important works of art come here to the market, and I can see them my own. So why should I bother and travel to Italy?
In many ways, Rembrandt's desire to get on mimicked the kind of attitude that was present in the new nation of the United Provinces of Holland at the same time.
I think one of the most important teachers is not the word, but the influences must have been his friend Jan Lievens, who was younger than Rembrandt, but who was a child prodigy actually. He must have a great self-confidence, and one gets the feeling that he must have inspired in the first few years Rembrandt strongly, and that they then came into sort of artistic combat, so to say, and so his presence, and they may have even shared a studio, must have been of great importance for Rembrandt.
Lievens was seen as having greater ambitions, wanting to paint on a larger scale than Rembrandt. Rembrandt at this point is painting on quite a small scale, and that's a huge difference if one compares his early work with the work of his middle life.
In 1625, the 19-year-old artist was sufficiently talented to set up his own studio in his home city. The oldest known Rembrandt painting dates from that year. For its subject matter, the artist turned to the one book that filled him with enthusiasm: the Bible. This is the martyrdom of Saint Stephen, a vibrant, dramatic canvas depicting the execution by stoning of the first Christian martyr. It's known as a history painting, which at the time was the highly regarded style of painting. With this canvas, the young Rembrandt proved his ability in the genre.
To be a history painter, you had to be able to paint anything. You know, you had to be a good still life painter because there were objects in the history. You had to be able to paint human flesh and the human proportions and human emotions, and you had to be able to paint a landscape if the history is playing in a landscape, etc. So only on the basis of that, history painting had a very high prestige. The work of Elsheimer he took as a starting point. And it is amazing how he develops his own stage direction for this scene. And it's a very clever painting, and in certain details it's absolutely already a masterpiece.
Rembrandt was not only inspired by the New Testament. In this 1636 canvas, Rembrandt brought to life a terrible event described in the Book of Judges: the blinding of the Hebrew legend Samson by Philistine warriors. In the background, we see the Philistine woman Delilah clutching the hair that was the source of Samson's strength. In the foreground, the artist spares the viewer nothing in climactic drama. Samson's facial contortions are exactly what we would expect from anyone undergoing such a fate. Rembrandt also proved his ability to incorporate further narrative elements into the image, not just the actual moment of blinding. It is an image corresponding to the artistic spirit of the times, the spirit of the Baroque. Another example of Rembrandt's Old Testament paintings can be seen in London's National Gallery. This 1635 canvas depicts the feast of the Babylonian prince Belshazzar and reveals the enthusiasm for exotic jewelry and fabrics that would stay with Rembrandt throughout his working life. This can also be seen in a painting from 4 years earlier, a depiction of Rembrandt's mother as the biblical prophetess Hannah. Rembrandt's craving for expensive exotic objects led him to purchase large quantities of them, a habit that would eventually cause his financial downfall. Although religious paintings made Rembrandt wealthy, portrait commissions also began to arrive, especially from the rich burghers of Amsterdam. By 1631, Rembrandt had decided that he should relocate to the great city, and his early years in Amsterdam would be the most successful of his working life. There was huge demand amongst its wealthier citizens for self-portraits. Frans Hals showed how a portraitist could capture the personality of the sitter at an instant in time. This portrait of the merchant Nicholas Rotz proved that Rembrandt also possessed an uncanny ability to depict his fellow man. Seventeenth-century Holland saw the creation of some of the greatest portraiture of all time. But it was not only individuals who sat for artists like Hals and Rembrandt. Dutch artists were often called upon to create group portraits, a form of painting which was virtually unknown outside Holland. Frans Hals was the first artist to fully master the technical difficulties of portraying a group while still maintaining the individual personality of the component figures. Once in Amsterdam, Rembrandt also turned to the specifically Dutch branch of painting. This is Dr. Nicolaas Tulp, Amsterdam's most famous surgeon of the day. In 1632, this eminent man of science commissioned Rembrandt to paint him at work, dissecting a corpse's arm while 7 of his fellow doctors looked on. The result was one of Rembrandt's most enduring images, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp.
It's quite likely that this was a private lesson rather than a public dissection, because Dr. Tulp is showing how to dissect an arm. He's showing the muscles and the tendons of an arm. Usually in a public dissection, you would start at the abdomen. And it's interesting that all of these members of the Surgeon Guild are watching intently at what's going on. They're not blandly staring out at us. And of course, the corpse itself plays a role in this painting. It's almost certainly an executed criminal. Criminals' bodies were used for dissection. So what Rembrandt gives us is not simply a group portrait, he actually animates the event into a history painting.
Rembrandt returned to the genre of group portraiture for some of the best-known paintings of his career. But while biblical paintings and portraits would comprise the bulk of his life's work, he also painted nudes, still lifes, and a small body of landscape paintings. Many believe that the finest of these is this small canvas, The Mill. Admirers of this romantic scene have included the great English landscapists Turner and Constable. By the time Rembrandt was 30, his talent was renowned in Amsterdam. Rembrandt's social status was propelled by his marriage in 1634 to the wealthy Saskia van Uylenbach, a relative of the art dealer with whom Rembrandt had lived 2 years previously. Despite marrying into wealth, Rembrandt was financially reckless. He loaned large sums of money to friends and spent substantial sums on ancient sculptures, Renaissance artworks, and exotic objects from the East. But in the early years of his marriage, Rembrandt's main priority would not be money. In 1635, Saskia gave birth to a son, Rombertus. Tragically, he died just a few months later. 2 daughters followed, who also died in early infancy. By 1641, Saskia bore a healthy boy, Titus. Unsurprisingly, both son and mother would be popular subjects for Rembrandt's brush. His portraits of Saskia and Titus reveal not only the artist's limited palette and his mastery of chiaroscuro, but his sheer love of his family. If the loss of his infant children affected Rembrandt the man, it fails to reveal itself in images like this. By the end of the 1630s, Rembrandt was not only a great artist in his own right, but was also renowned as a teacher. Pupils came from all over Holland to study in his studio, and many would become significant artists. The prodigious output of paintings from this studio has created a problem for the modern student, because many works that were once thought to be Rembrandt originals have been proved to be the work of his students.
In 1968, the Rembrandt Research Project was set up in Amsterdam with money from the Dutch government. Their brief, if you like, was to try to sort out what was a genuine and what was a student painting. And of course, there are also fakes as well. At the start of the century, there were probably 1,000 so-called Rembrandts. By the 60s, that had gone down to 600, and nowadays we probably think there's something between 400 and 500.
To begin with, it took quite long before we had to admit that most non-Rembrandt, so to say, must have been from the studio and from students. But then there are groups of works by students which sort of run parallel and are dependent on the works of Rembrandt. So once you have these pairs of work by the master and a copy, you develop an eye for what is Rembrandt and what is the students.
The uncertainty that surrounded some of the paintings produced in Rembrandt's studio is matched by details of the artist himself. There are long periods of time when there are virtually no surviving documents which mention his existence, and actual quotes from Rembrandt himself are almost non-existent. We do know that in 1639 he purchased this house, number 4 Jodenbriestraat, in the Jewish quarter of the city. The price was 13,000 florins. Despite Rembrandt's apparent financial success, he borrowed the money to buy number 4 Jodenbriestraat. Rembrandt's marriage to Saskia had brought with it a dowry of 20,000 florins. His individual portraits sold for 500 florins each, and his many students each paid 100 florins a year for the privilege of working alongside him. In 1640, the death of Rembrandt's mother meant a financial inheritance. But despite all this wealth, he chose not to use it to pay off his mortgage, preferring instead to indulge his passion for possessions. Rembrandt's financial recklessness took years to catch up with him. By the early 1640s, he was still a wealthy man, but in 1642, his fortunes began to change. In his personal life, it was a tragic year. On the 14th of June, his beloved wife Saskia died. The deaths of 3 children had affected her own health. Rembrandt's only consolation was that Saskia's final child, Titus, would survive into adulthood. Before his wife's death, Rembrandt had completed a group portrait commissioned by a militia company, one of many groups of civic guards that emerged in the larger Dutch towns and cities following the withdrawal of the Spanish. Their leaders were often men of the highest status in Dutch society. Here we can see the high status of Captain Frans Banning Kock. Alongside his lieutenant, he dominates the foreground, with the Rembrandt's mastery of light contributing strongly to this effect. All are involved in what appears to be more a narrative action scene than a group portrait. This is a very different image from the anatomy lesson of the years before, and it is possibly the most famous painting of Rembrandt's career, The Night Watch.
The light and dark structure in his work, which gives you the feeling that the light is, you could say, not spotlighting on the things. The light more and more starts roaming in space. And he was more than any other painter able to combine the use of light with creating a sense of atmosphere in which the figures are acting. In the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, he managed to sort of organize a group of people in a very direct, telling way. But in the case of The Night Watch, he had this intention to depict the moment in which the chaos of people running around and appearing from an archway into a well-organized grouping, and that is the gesture of the man in the foreground, Banning Kock, to his lieutenant, etc. So there's a chaos which is about to brought into order, and he must have thought that was the best way to introduce really life itself instead of sort of a military parade.
The Night Watch was one of the most remarkable paintings of the Dutch century, and it also marks a significant turning point in Rembrandt's life. Rembrandt was receiving fewer valuable portrait commissions. It has been suggested that the Night Watch itself was to blame for this. According to opinion, Rembrandt's work was simply too original, and wealthy patrons now grew reluctant to trust such a virtuoso artist with their commissions. A more likely explanation is that a fashion for intricately detailed paintings now began to emerge. After 1642, Rembrandt's commissions were dwindling, and this caused him to default on payments for his home. But Rembrandt's work was still widely known, increasingly through his work in an entirely different medium, a medium which he may not have invented, but which he brought to an unsurpassed level of artistic achievement: etching. Many of these images can be seen in Rembrandt's old house on the Breestraat. Early in the 20th century, the Rembrandt House Foundation was formed, and it has been its responsibility to collect and maintain this priceless collection of Rembrandt's graphic work. Rembrandt chose the same subject matter for his etchings as he did for his work in paint. This is especially true with his religious images. As Rembrandt entered middle age, his etchings were amongst his most popular works, and they sold for good sums of money. But by the middle of that decade, Rembrandt's financial situation had come to a head. And in 1656, he was declared bankrupt. Over the next 2 years, his house and possessions were sold to pay his creditors. The inventory of his objects revealed a diverse collection of sculptures, art from all over the world, jewelry, weapons, and armor. But not even the sale of all his worldly goods was enough to clear Rembrandt's debts completely.
At a certain point in the late 50s, there were the wars with England, which had a very bad effect on the Dutch economy, and incomes fell. And Rembrandt also stopped, not stopped really, but did not paint so much portrait anymore, which seems to be a quite deliberate action, choice. And these portraits, for which he received often 100 guilders or something, were a steady source of income.
Remarkably, Rembrandt's perilous financial situation failed to diminish the quality of his work. As bankruptcy loomed, he painted the portrait of Jan Six, which shows his unique approach to brushwork. After being declared insolvent, and despite having no settled Amsterdam residence, his art continued to develop. And the images he created in the last 10 years of his life are among his greatest. In 1660, Heinrici Stoffels and Titus set up an arrangement whereby Rembrandt formally became an employee of their art shop, with an advance of 1,750 florins. Despite the generosity of his son and mistress, Rembrandt's days of celebrity were now in the past. At this time, commissions to paint the interior of Amsterdam's new town hall were being given to the artists of the day, and they represented a gold rush of opportunity, but Rembrandt was not among these artists. Only the death of his former pupil, Govert Flinck, meant that Rembrandt received one commission: The Conspiracy of Claudius Civilius, a depiction of a Netherland tribe rebelling against the Romans in AD 70. It was a suitable subject for a confident nation that had only shaken off Spanish domination decades earlier. But the canvas was not well received, and it was removed from the town hall shortly after its completion. But Rembrandt still possessed enough influence to secure a commission for a final group portrait, a painting of 6 members of the Clothmakers' Guild. Completed in 1662, it is the third of the artist's great group portraits, following the anatomy lesson and the night watch. At first glance, this image seems to have more in common with Rembrandt's first group masterpiece. It is an uncomplicated image with no great sense of Baroque drama. But it does reveal the older Rembrandt's total mastery of painting human beings as real living individuals, with their own lives and concerns, an ability shared by Frans Hals.
It is absolutely fascinating painting, partly from the way he deals with the subject and partly the way he deals with paint and with the means he used. I mean, there is this group of faces is absolutely superb in its presence. But that is not only through his genius as a painter. He must have thought very much about how to arrange them, and when you read the X-ray you can see that they keep moving and changing positions, etc. And in the end they all look in the same direction. That brings in unity into the painting, and there is a whole literature about what he meant by that, but I think it's still a way to make a group portrait in a history painting.
By 1662, the painter of this remarkable canvas was approaching old age. Sadly, these final years would be marked by still more personal tragedy for Rembrandt. In 1663, his mistress Heinrike Stoffels died. In 1668, his beloved son Titus died at the age of 27. Rembrandt was now a lonely man of 62, with only months to live. But he never stopped painting until the day of his death, and in the final year of his life, Rembrandt painted the last installment in what had been a lifelong enterprise, self-portraiture. This is Rembrandt's final great canvas depicting himself in 1669. This is the highly chiaroscuro painting of himself from 40 years previously. In the interim, Rembrandt continually used himself as subject matter for his paintings. This self-portrait of 1640 shows a confident and wealthy artist at the height of his fame. Taken together, these images have been seen as a visual autobiography without parallel in the history of art. A succession of paintings where Rembrandt never hides his own physical flaws. For many, it is this final canvas that is the greatest of them all. Rembrandt's mastery of self-portraiture in paint was matched by a similar ability with the needle. Although for reasons unknown, he virtually stopped etching self-portraits while still in his early 30s. When Rembrandt van Rijn died on the 4th of October 1669, he was a lonely and debt-stricken man. It is said that at the time of his death, he possessed nothing but his clothes and his painting materials. Four days later, he was buried in Amsterdam's Westerkerk Church. Such a contrast between worldly wealth and artistic greatness is not unusual in the history of art. But in the case of Rembrandt, it is difficult not to be astonished. Such was the sheer size of his life's achievement. Only posterity has given him his deserved status as one of the greatest of the Dutch masters.